It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. John Warner is the President and Chief Technology Officer for the Warner Babcock Institute for Green Chemistry. Welcome, John.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's, I think, a bit of a different talk for you all. I'm going to be talking about green chemistry, but I think you'll find it very much closely related to what it is that you do, and hopefully you find it useful in looking at the different aspects of this meeting. We're in a very crazy world, especially me being a chemist. You turn on the radio, you open up a newspaper, you look on the internet, and you hear about this molecule is killing us, this thing is dangerous, this thing is scary, this one is toxic, this is killing us, this is bad, this is dangerous, this is scary, this is bad, this is killing us. It's almost exhausting that we keep hearing about what's the next thing that's going to be killing us, you know? It's like the game whack-a-mole. You know, what is the mascot of the American Chemical Society? It's actually a mole. We're playing whack-a-mole with chemistry all the time, right? We hear about brominated flame retardants, whack. We hear about phthalates, whack. We hear about bisphenol, whack. And we're thinking about one thing, we hear about another thing. We're not quite sure if this is toxic. We don't know if this is hype. And we're kind of breathless and we're kind of scared, but we just don't know. Is this really serious and dangerous? Or is it just a bunch of nonsense? And I gotta tell you, that's a serious problem. And I think that we need to be asking ourselves, let's accept the fact that maybe there are some red dyes out there that cause cancer. Let's accept that there may be plasticizers that cause birth defects. And there are some toxic things out there that are dangerous. Well, are we asking the right questions? Instead of asking, is this toxic, there's a more fundamental question is, why would a chemist make a hazardous material in the first place? You know, isn't that really more fundamental? Hey, if we've got all these people going out and getting PhDs in chemistry, why is it that they wouldn't just make things that are safe? Why are they making things that are hazardous? So maybe instead of looking at how we make molecules, we should be looking a little bit more at how do we make chemists, all right? And so my background, I am my doctorate was in chemistry from Princeton, but I'm actually a medicinal chemist, and so my training was in pharmaceutical chemistry. There's a drug called Alimta that is sold by the Eli Lilly company. It's one of the most successful anti-cancer drugs in history for solid tumors. Lost my mom in 2002. She was receiving the drug that I had helped work on about 15 years earlier. Okay, so very, very interesting molecule. 2 years ago, Princeton University opened up a 7-story chemistry laboratory based entirely on the proceeds of this one drug. So the royalties from that, from Eli Lilly, paid for an entire chemistry building. Well, I thought I was going to be a professor. I thought I was going to go into academia and be a medicinal chemist, when out of the blue, vice president from the Polaroid Corporation met me and offered me a job to head exploratory research at Polaroid. You know, that's Edwin Land, famous inventor of instant photography. Someday I'm going to say, hey, do you know what an instant photograph is? And my audience is going to say, what? You know, it's kind of a dying thing, but it was back in the 80s when I was working there, it was the coolest place to be. If you were an organic chemist, this was the coolest place to work. And for 10 years, I had a blast there. And one of the things you got to ask, what would a medicinal chemist do at a manufacturing company like Polaroid? And I started asking myself interesting questions. You know, around this time, chemistry is about 180 years old. Lavoisier back 180 years before when I started at Polaroid, kind of started the field of chemistry. We make beautiful molecules, right? The drugs that are curing people, the agricultural agents that are keeping people fed, our textiles, our electronics, the materials that we work with are fascinating and beautiful. But if you look at how we manufacture everything, we heat things under high temperature, we apply high pressure, and we use all these harsh solvents and reagents. Now, if you look out the window and you look at nature, and you look at a leaf, or you look at a cell or an organism, nature over produces better than us, hands down, in molecular diversity, in structure, and complexity. But not only that, but nature does everything at room temperature. Nature does everything at ambient pressure and uses water for the most part as a solvent. So not only does nature not only make better molecules than us, it manufactures these things in a better way than us. So me being introspective, I said, why? Why is it that nature does such a good job? And that's when it hit me. I say a thermometer is a molecular speedometer. You remember in your chemistry classes in high school that temperature is a function of molecular velocity, right? When the air molecules are moving fast, the temperature goes up. When the air molecules are moving slow, the temperature goes down. And it's really related to molecular velocity. Right, and so I started thinking about this. And we in chemistry, when we learn about chemical reactions, what we find out is that molecules bang into each other all the time when they're undergoing chemical reactions. All right? But what happens is usually two molecules just bang off of each other. They don't do a chemical reaction because for a chemical reaction to happen, the trajectory has to be perfect. In 360-degree spherical space, the molecule has to bump in at exactly the right angle for a chemical reaction to happen. And so the reason we heat things up in manufacturing, the reason we put things under pressure is so that they bang into each other more often. But that doesn't cause the reaction to happen, it just happens more often. So statistically, the chance of the right thing happening goes on. My epiphany was that in nature, that never happens. In cells, in trees, in plants, in squids, everything out there, if you look at the molecular level, the molecules never bang into each other. But inside a biological organism, the molecules first attach to each other. And they make some kind of an attachment using non-covalent forces. And then once they're docked, then they react. And I called that non-covalent derivatization. Now, I could talk to you for years just standing here until you're all sound asleep talking about non-covalent. I'm the world's biggest nerd. The license plate of my car is NCD for non-covalent derivatization. So I really get into this, okay? But at Polaroid, I started to look at manufacturing processes and say, how can I reduce defect rates? How can I increase yield? How can I make this happen faster? How can I make this happen faster? And started playing around with different things to look at this idea of having things first attach to each other, then react. Two-step process, attach and react. And I got lucky, and some of my materials actually went into large-scale manufacturing. Now, in the United States, to go to large-scale manufacturing, as many people in this room know, you can't just do it. You have to get EPA approval. You have to get what's called a low-volume exemption, pre-manufacturing notification. I suspect some people have gone through this. Now, this is back now in 1990, 1989. This is before computers and things like that. I had to fill up bankers' boxes, wrap them up, and ship them to Washington, D.C., and wait for the EPA, and wait, and wait. And finally, after a couple months, they rejected my application. Not because of toxicity, not because of environmental impact. They just didn't understand this crazy guy talking about non-covalent derivatization. They said, small particles, are you crazy? Molecular complexes, are you high? They had no idea what I was talking about. So Polaroid stuck me on an airplane and sent me to Washington, D.C. to talk about non-covalent derivatization. So I go, it's the first time in my life I'd been on an airplane. I'm holding a briefcase of overhead slides. I'm a little bit scared. I'm a little mad. And I go, and I meet the branch chief of the Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics, this guy named Paul Anastas. Wait a minute, I recognize this guy. He went to undergraduate with me. I've known him since I was 11 years old. In fact, at that moment, I was playing in a jazz band with his older brother. There's his older brother on the saxophone. There's me a long time ago on the keyboard, and my older brother with awesome hair, all right? And this guy here, if you've ever been to Las Vegas, the dude in Legends of Rock that plays Rod Stewart, that's him. Has nothing to do with this talk, but it's kind of cool. And so I could give this guy a dope slap upside the head and say, hey, For the last 10 years, we've been manufacturing these materials using solvents, several-step reactions, high-energy, hazardous reagents. Here it is, I've invented something that is non-toxic, environmentally benign, and you're giving me a hard time because it's different? Isn't anything that is going to be less toxic, anything that's going to have less impact on the environment by definition, going to be new and different? If the EPA makes it difficult to go into manufacturing anything new and different, aren't they orthogonal to exactly what their mission is? And that's when it hit me. We needed to think about this in a very different way. The EPA needs to promote technologies that are less toxic, environmentally benign, not just go out and regulate. But what is it? What is it that they should promote? Non-toxic, environmentally benign, low energy, less, persistence in the environment, all this stuff here. Well, it turns out we had no words for it. In science, we like our meetings. Look, at right now in Kansas City, there's a bunch of people talking about asphalt preservation. It's a pretty narrowly focused group here, all right? Somewhere else on the planet, there's a group of people probably talking about the potential of intelligence of belly button lint, and somewhere else, diseases of the third toe of the left foot. We love in our sciences to break down and have journals and workshops on these little teeny subdivisions of science. In 1989, 1990, there was no subdivision of science of how do you make a product that has less impact on the environment, that is less toxic, that all those words. And that was the birth of green chemistry. So a guy in industry at Polaroid and a guy at the EPA came up with this concept of green chemistry. Now, the whole point of green chemistry is the active process of making products safer. Okay? It's not a journal article. It can't be dependent on regulations. It can't be dependent on incentives. It must work by the market forces that exist. So yes, a green chemistry technology has to be more environmentally benign than an alternative technology, but that's not enough. It also has to have superior performance. No one's going to buy a cleaner that doesn't clean just because it's environmentally benign, and it has to have the right cost. And so, first of all, there's a moral and ethical thing. It can't be just rich people can afford safe stuff, but also it's just got to be successful in the marketplace. So only if you have the safety, performance, and cost do you have what I call green chemistry. All right, and that's the important point. So there's been, up to that point, there was a lot of regulations and laws and things like that forcing people to use expensive technologies that really didn't work. The change here was to say, no, all three have to go in. That is green chemistry. So Paul and I, we wrote a book. And I tell you, if I thought anyone was ever going to read this book, I would have written a better book. But it's kind of, I feel like Forrest Gump. After this book came out, it got translated into 15 different languages. I've been, in the last 20 years, I've been to over 40 countries meeting presidents and prime ministers and giving talks about the 12 principles of green chemistry. And I got to tell you, anyone could have written this book. There's nothing special. It's just obvious, gee whiz, something should work good, should cost good, and be better for the environment. That's not a really brilliant thought. And that's all this book was. But what it did was it reduced it to, what do you tell a chemist wearing a lab coat with a pocket protector, pouring beakers and flasks in the lab? How do they think about that end game? Because that chemist that just came from university is never going to see the real world, and they're not going to understand the real world. And so these 12 principles were written to help translate the real world to the discovery scientists that we need to invent things. And so over the past 25 years, if you do a search of the technical literature and mentions of green chemistry, you can see the book came out in '98. It was hardcover, too expensive. In 2000, softcover version came out. And you see this explosion. So the green squares are the academic papers. But what's really cool is the blue triangles are the patents, the US and international patents that talk about green chemistry. It's an interesting challenge. And we started what's now called the Presidential Green Chemistry Challenge Award. This is an award given by the U.S. President and the National Academy of Sciences every year. It is the only award given by the President of the United States with the word chemistry in it. We started this in 1996 in the Clinton administration. It survived transition to the Bush administration, to the Obama administration. 20 years later, it's going strong. Every year, 5 companies get an award for a technology that demonstrates performance, cost, and benefit to the environment. This is a growing, thriving thing, and if you go onto the EPA website, you can see all kinds of case studies of how companies have done this. But you know, there's also another aspect to this, though. And the other aspect is, you know, there are books like this. If anyone's not read this book, I urge you to read this book. It's now 20 years old. It's called Our Stolen Future, and it talks about how molecules and commerce impact the human species. And it's a scary book, so you're not going to sleep at night after reading this. But at this point in my life, around 1995, 1994, I realized here I am, a synthetic organic chemist from an Ivy League university. I've been given a document, you know, a degree, a diploma to go out and invent for future things. And I realized I never had a chemistry class that taught me about toxicity, about environmental impact. Every year in the United States, we graduate 15,000 degrees, undergraduate degrees, 3,000 masters, 3,000 doctoral degrees. For the first time in history, in 2004, more women became chemists than men, and yet not one university in the country requires a chemist to take a class in toxicology or environmental impact. So how can they invent products that are earthy, crunchy, and everybody loves, if at the molecular level they're not learning anything about that? And so I left Polaroid after 10 years, and I went into academia. I went to UMass Boston and UMass Lowell, full professor, chair of chemistry, director of biochemistry, plastics engineering, and we created a PhD program in green chemistry. And for the next 10 years, 120 students passed through a program where they learned everything that a quote-unquote normal chemistry student would learn, but added a one-semester class in mechanistic toxicology, added a one-semester class in environmental mechanisms, added a one-semester class in law and policy, so that when they got a job, they would understand it. The average time it took one of these students to get a job upon graduating, 2 days. The longest any student in this program looked for a job was 2 weeks, because she turned down the first 7 job offers. Still today, I'm getting phone calls because companies are saying, you mean you can invent, you can do stuff that other chemists can't, but you also have a clue about environmental regulations? Clearly, the single biggest impediment to success in commercial US, if not the world, is understanding the global regulations that are changing on a constant basis. Of all the products and processes that we have available to us, I would argue 10% are truly benign. 25% of them might have some available alternative in the supply chain somewhere. But today in 2015, 65% still haven't been invented. That's the opportunity. Companies who can realize this and help steer an invention to change and turn a traditional technology into one that people are going to accept as being environmentally responsible and non-toxic, that's where it's at. This is about economic development. This is about commercial development. And so that's the plan here, is to understand how to create a workforce that's capable of understanding how to invent within this framework. Because products, of course, you turn molecules into materials, we call that basic research. Materials into components, we call that applied research. When we turn components into devices, we call that development. When we do a lot of it, we call it manufacturing. When we do this, what's most important? Performance, cost, societal. Hey, wasn't that my definition of green chemistry? There's nothing new here. This is the way business has operated for 100 years. It's just now we got to put environment in the middle of it and say, where did the molecules come from? Where do the molecules go when we manufacture it and sell it and use it? Who's the only person who can change the toxicity or environmental impact profile? The person who invents it. Once it's invented and it's a product, that's done. The cows are out of that barn. And so the idea is to get this not as an industrial program as much as it is an education program for the next generation of scientists. It's not chemicals policy. Okay, chemicals policy, people writing laws and stuff like that, that's great for the demand. But it's important to realize green chemistry is on the supply chain. It's the people inventing, not the people writing the laws. It's the chemists in the lab, the scientists and engineers that are inventing do green chemistry. It's not a policy. California kind of messed it up. They came out with what's called green chemistry regulations. And I drop on the floor in the fetal position and cry like a baby every time I hear about that, because they missed the point entirely. This is not about regulation, it's about invention. And whenever you see something in green chemistry talking about regulation, they didn't read the book, because the first page of the book says this is not about regulation. A chemist, this isn't the birth of ethics. People who don't do green chemistry, it's not like they don't care about toxicity, environmental impact, but think about it. You ever talk to a chemist and say, hey, I worked with this dangerous material? We almost brag about how we work with dangerous stuff, but we wear gloves to protect our skin. We wear masks to protect our lungs. We put on goggles to protect our eyes. We install scrubbers and smokestacks to protect the air, the land, and the sea. We accept that we work with toxic, hazardous materials, but we protect ourselves and everybody else by controlling exposure. My first slide, when I said all these disasters and these temporal things, what in each of those cases, one of these things failed. And so what green chemistry is, if it's a revolution, is say instead of depending on exposure, get the eggheads in the lab to invent things that are not hazardous in the first place. Now, this is no simple task. We can't snap our fingers and tomorrow have everything be safe. It's going to take decades and decades of time because they're not prepared to understand those mechanisms. But we got to start somewhere. And that's the point of green chemistry, is to always be pushing. Until we have the safe technologies, we're going to have to rely on exposure control. But imagine a day when we don't. I'm not going to be alive for it. Probably no one in this room will be. But it will happen someday if we change the way we think about chemistry. Think about it. Whenever you had your chemistry class, either as middle school, high school, or if you had it in college, if I held a flask up in front of you, and I said, let's describe the material science of this flask. Someone's going to say, oh, it's a solid. Someone's going to say, it melts at 23 degrees. Someone's going to say, oh, it's dissolvable in water. And we'll get all these fancy words of viscosity and all that. But no one in this room, or no one in any audience, is likely to say it's not toxic. It has negligible impact on the environment. When we think of describing stuff, we never think of toxicity and environmental impact as being part of that description. So of course we're in the situation that we are. So green chemistry is saying, let's put that just as part of the description of stuff. And in the same way that I know how to make a molecule red, or I know how to make a solution more viscous, get me learning at university how to make things less toxic and have less impact on the environment, and there'll be a day when we laugh about this because it's just part of how we do business. It's difficult today because it's a huge quantum leap. But if we stop making efforts to change. So there is this thing called the Green Chemistry Commitment, asking universities to sign on and start in that direction. And there's been about 50 universities have signed. University of Minnesota is the closest one to here that actually signed the commitment. UC Berkeley, UC Davis, a bunch of, so about 50 universities have signed on. So I'm confident that the future is bright. Because of course, the cost, if you have a hazardous material and you have a safe material, it costs more to store, transport, treat. Who wouldn't want the safer material? What I did was I went back to 1870 and I went to the Federal Register and looked at all the environmental laws imposed by the federal government around the environment. Not a whole heck of a lot happened until 1962. Rachel Carson publishes Silent Spring. It's the birth of the modern environmental movement. I'm a chemist. I'm not a statistician or a mathematician, but I see a trend here. All right, this is kind of interesting. And so companies get it, but they don't have a workforce capable of responding to it. And so we need to fill our toolbox. If you think of the chemical enterprises and ways of doing carbon bond forming, oxidations, reductions, hydroxylation, whatever, we have a full toolbox. But if you imagine an environmentally benign toolbox, that's pretty much empty. And so that's the future, but it's also the financial opportunity. Pike Research did an assessment. They say in 2020, green chemistry will be a $100 billion global industry. It already made it that. It's 2012, and it already is. All right, this is a major mega trend. Companies are getting, I can't name any major Fortune 50 company that doesn't have a green chemistry program. Well, not many universities are getting it, but industry has figured it out. So in 2007, me and James and Jim Babcock, we started an organization called the Warner Babcock Institute for Green Chemistry to just unburden ourselves from the academic world. Don't publish papers, don't go to technical conferences, get the best research lab that you could possibly imagine with all the equipment you need, get 36 of the smartest, beautiful, smart scientists, and just invent stuff. And so we have a bunch of different industry sectors that we serve, and we have two models. One is we do contract invention, where we work with third-party companies and we invent for them. We do the invention, we help them with commercialization. And then we have our self-funded research, where we come up with our own ideas and we invent for that, and then we either commercialize or license it. And so we have two spin-out organizations, Collaborative Aggregates for material science and Collaborative Medicinal Development for pharmaceuticals. Now, to show you the opportunities of green chemistry, let me just talk about a couple things that have happened in just the last 3 years. Just the last 3 years. In pharmaceuticals, we have a Parkinson's ALS disease drug that is in clinical trials in Australia. It's this molecule that is profoundly insoluble. So you can get it into laboratory animals and you can see that it has an effect, but the FDA would never approve it because it's too insoluble. So using non-covalent derivatization, we came up with a way of solubilizing it and making it more effective. Michael J. Fox funded it for a little bit, and now it's in clinical trials in Australia. We have an Alzheimer's drug. This Alzheimer's drug, what we did is, it's kind of fun to look at this. In April of 2012, the height on this graph is what the effective dose is. And so in 2012, it was up here. In June of 2012, we made it more effective. In September of 2012, we made it more effective. In November, we made it more effective. In January, this is nanomolar effectiveness for Alzheimer's disease. We are super positive and excited about this, looking for the next step. But then we also do materials in composites. Okay, and here I'm going to embarrass myself in front of a group of experts like you. I'm going to talk about asphalt. How can I possibly do that? All right, so I apologize. I'm going to say the wrong words. I'm going to say everything silly here. But as everyone in this room knows about malteens going into asphaltenes, you know what? This here is an image of the world's first photograph. Okay, remember, I worked at Polaroid. Right? In 1825, this dude named Joseph Nietzsche, he took a material, put it on a piece of metal, put a lens in front of it, and where the sunlight and the air hit it, it got brittle. He washed it off with an organic solvent, and he made a negative image. The world's first photograph. You know what it was? Asphalt. So when I learned that the sunlight and air was damaging pavement, I go, well, no kidding. For 200 years, that's how we made photographs. And working at Polaroid and failing to improve that, every time I failed to improve it, I said, maybe that's a solution to this problem here. And so I had 21 patents in photography at that point in this kind of technology. And so I looked at it this way. I said, okay, when sunlight hits, you make a photo image of the oxidative damage in the pavement. If I can skim that off and come up with a molecule, remember this coming in contact and interacting, if I can have the molecules come in contact with each other, pull the damaged material off of the aggregate. Now here's the cool thing, dilute it up so that little tiny infinitesimal photo damage gets diluted into the asphalt, then the molecule turns around and docks onto the aggregate so that it pulls the asphalt back into the aggregate. Essentially now you've completely replaced the asphalt in the aggregate. It comes down and you've now got a nice new pavement. And so on November 25th, 2013, we dug up my driveway. My family was not very happy because my driveway was perfectly acceptable, but we had to try it somewhere. And we had two trucks coming, and they were laughing at me. The guys were laughing because they were saying, John, it's 17 degrees Fahrenheit. This is going to be a big hockey puck. It's just going to drop on your driveway and we're going to drive away. There was 70% recycled content of RAS and RAP. They said, no way, this is possible. Not going to happen. They open it up. It pours out beautifully. They pave it. This is last week. Okay, it's absolutely beautiful. And so we've started a company called Collaborative Aggregates, and the product is called Delta S. And again, I'm just the chemist. There are other people who can explain from the paving industry the bit of this, but that's kind of a fun approach that we've done. Now, I'm going to close with a thought. All right, one day I was at a company in Dracut, Mass, doing a test with the asphalt. Okay, we had just done a couple ton load and they dropped it down and I have a shovel. I'm wearing a hard hat, I'm wearing boots, I've got my shovel, standing in the asphalt, and my cell phone goes off. And it's some scientists in Finland saying, John, here is the results of your Alzheimer's test. You know, it's the mice got smarter here, the mice didn't get smarter here, and what's going on here? Now, someone may look at that and think that that's kind of strange, that someone working in asphalt would be doing neurochemistry. But guess what? The model that we're following for Alzheimer's is organic polymers wrapped around inorganic materials. The molecule that we invented snuggles up in between the polymer and the inorganic phase and separate. It's the same thing as what we're doing in asphalt. At the molecular level, the drug for Alzheimer's and Delta S are doing exactly the same thing. Once you get away from the applications and you look at the molecular level, that's where green chemistry, that's where invention happens, and that's what we just have a blast doing it. I'd love to give you more examples of some of the things that we're doing, but I see that we are out of time, and so I thank you for listening to me, and I hope that this helped you see green chemistry in a different perspective. Thank you.